Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution, and specifically our World Affairs program. I'm delighted to tell you, obviously, that John Gray is in the house and will give us a talk on this new book, The New Leviathans. But before we do, my name is Andreas Wasmuth. I'm the World Affairs convener here, also for philosophy, and I'm also a director of the institution. So welcome, everybody, on this this night. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome one of the philosophical greats of this country to the BLSI. John is well known around the world. He's particularly known for his many books, including Straw Dogs, False Dawn, Black Mass, Feline Philosophy, and obviously increasingly also for his latest book, which is The New Leviathans, a spin on the 17th century book by Thomas Hobbes, which most of you will probably know. But John is also used to be the professor of European thought at the London School of Economics, when he and then retired in 2008. And he is a regular contributor to The Guardian, The New Statesman, and the Literary Supplement, Times Literary Supplement. And I think he's actually going to do another one, our point of view, or my point of view. That's why he's leaving tonight to go to London. Is it London, John?
Yes.
London, to do another interview on Radio 4 to do with our friend Donald Trump. So that's why he can't stay afterwards, and he needs to go quite sharpish when we finish. So you can see John has got many accolades, but the most fascinating for me is that there is an asteroid that has been named after John Gray, and it's asteroid 91199 John Gray. So that must be pretty unique. No, it's still orbiting. Good. Well, listen, put your hands together and welcome John Gray.
Well, thank you very much, Andreas, for that very warm and generous introduction. The asteroid hasn't stopped orbiting and crashed into the Earth yet, but I'm often told that my work is somewhat pessimistic. I don't know why, can't imagine why. And I suppose it is in some ways, in that I'm just trying to get at the truth, regardless of whether it's hopeful or not. And I was thinking on walking in tonight, if I could come up with some very hopeful perspective that would inspire you all during my talk, or at least towards the end of it. And frankly, I didn't come up with very much. In the current state of the world, it's not easy. I'm talking tomorrow about, it'll not be broadcast till Friday, but about Donald Trump. That may be one reason. But let me more seriously mention a real story of a friend of mine to whom a terrible thing happened, almost the worst thing that could happen to a human being. He lost the person he loved the most in the world. She died as a result of medical negligence. And for several years, he wept. He was inconsolable. And he consulted a number, I think more than a dozen psychotherapists, none of whom helped him until he met the last one, who he consulted. He only needed to consult once. And that therapist said, well, terrible things happen to you. You'll never recover. And he said, well, from that moment, I started recovering. From the moment that he knew that this had happened and it wouldn't unhappen, he started to recover. Well, I can't cure anyone in the way that wise psychiatrist, psychotherapist cured, but I'll try and set things out in a way which each of you can make their own. What's the New Leviathans? What is it about? What's the book about? And how does Hobbes fit into it? Let me ask a question before I go on. How many of you know anything much about Hobbes? Who he was? A few, I think maybe quite a few actually, but about Hobbes the man, Hobbes the person. I'll just say a little bit about him because it's relevant actually to the book. He lived during a time not unlike the present, a time of war, a time of civil and religious war. He was right in the middle of it. And it was also a time when you couldn't trust other people very much. some of his close intellectual colleagues turned against him in the course of the war. His books were burnt by the Bodleian Library, outside the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And one of his long-term friends who translated his works into other languages, Hobbes was one of the first, he wrote in Latin and other languages, but he wrote Leviathan in English, denied that he'd ever read any of Hobbes's books or ever had any of them on his shelf, because one could risk one's life by reading Hobbes at that time. And Hobbes fled the country. And here we find an interesting paradox in his character. He was very proud of being, as he said, the first of all that fled. His life was governed largely, his physical life, his outer life, by fear. And he thought that the fundamental or primordial human emotion, which explained most other aspects of human life, was fear. Not as you often find in histories of political thought. They say Hobbes believed all human beings try to aim for power. He did think that, but the reason they aimed for power was they were afraid of other human beings. So he was writing at a time when order in society broke down, and human beings fell into what he called a state of nature. Now, a state of nature was not, for Hobbes, a time before society or the state. A state of nature was a condition of breakdown that could happen at any time, anywhere. And when that happens, there's no law. Each human being, each family, each group seeks safety in any way it can, which includes looking for powerful protectors or attacking others who might then attack them, and seeking power over others in order to protect their lives. So one initial misconception we must get rid of when thinking about Hobbes is that he's a theorist of power, or even of selfishness, because actually people say Hobbes believed in selfishness. What was one of the, he argued that people only do what's in their own interests. And he was attacked for that reason in the 17th century. His great book, Leviathan, came out in 1651. It was immediately attacked. There were over 100 hostile reviews, often from people in the church who hated him and thought he was an atheist. He wasn't actually an atheist in their sense, but in another sense he was. I'll come back to that shortly, the sense in which he was an atheist. But he didn't think that human beings were necessarily selfish, because he didn't really believe that there was a fixed ego. He actually thought that each of us was a sum or a succession or a river of thoughts and passions and desires that kept on flowing until it stopped. And the stop for us was death. So right at the center of his thought is the avoidance of death, because he thinks the fear of death, especially a violent death at the hands of other human beings, is the dominant human passion. And I think there's a lot of truth in this, but it's actually, I'll come to that towards the end, I think it's actually mistaken. I think Hobbes was wrong in thinking that the fear of death or self-preservation is always or nearly always the dominant human passion. Human beings are distinguished from other animals by the knowledge of their mortality. Maybe some other animals have a sense of death. Elephants are said to circle an elephant when it's died, but I don't think they measure out their own lives in terms of forthcoming death. They don't have a conception of death as being, so to speak, written into their lives. If any of you have ever kept cats or had cats keep you, I should probably say the other way around. I've written a book on cats and kept cats for 30 years. If you observe them, I don't think they have any idea of their lives being finite or mortal. But when they get a dim sense that it's coming to an end, and only then, they sneak off and hide somewhere quiet and peaceful and try to die. They don't fight it. They just accept it. But they don't have what humans have, which is that we have a foreknowledge of our own mortality. We know when we have a finite life. We know that we and all the other people we love have finite lives. And it's that, rather than the fear of being simply killed by others, that I think Hobbes missed out, because what he missed out is that people will die for a meaning in their life. But he didn't miss it out entirely, because he wrote a chapter with a wonderful, or part of a chapter with the wonderful title 7 Types of Absurdity. And among the 7 types of absurdity is thinking that words or concepts are real things. And he thought that human beings, this is inconsistent with his main philosophy. He thought that human beings can live and die and kill, importantly, for the sake of a word or a concept or an idea. And if that's true, then it isn't just self-preservation. People will gladly give up their lives or kill others and kill others. They'll go to certain death for the sake of an idea, a word, a vision. And that can make them, to my mind, better than Hobbes thought they were, but also worse, because they can kill other people for no other reason than that those other people don't fit into a certain concept that they have of what a human being is or might be. They don't fit into a certain story they've developed of their own lives. Well, Hobbes, he was timid in his life. He spent most of his life as a domestic servant of an aristocratic house, which gave him a lot of freedom. He traveled with the children of the house across Europe, met lots of the leading scientists and philosophers, Descartes, Galileo, and so on. Had a lot of freedom, but he was always very cautious in his dealings with other human beings, except in thought. In thought, he was immensely proud and uncompromising, and that's one of the reasons he never became a churchman. One could have a relatively easy life in those days if one became a churchman and stuck in one's public pronouncements to church dogma or church doctrine. He wouldn't do it. So he's interesting. It's an interesting paradox. He was very cautious and prudent in his life, lived till he was over 90, was a man who lived by routine mostly, got up at a certain time, collected his thoughts, had breakfast, went for a walk, wrote them down practically whenever he could. But the pattern of his thinking is very bold, very stark. I rather like that, along with his lapidary, stark prose. So the theme of the book in Hobbes is that human beings will, when they face the horrors of the state of nature, of uncertainty, of violence and danger, they'll erect what he called a Leviathan. They'll erect a sovereign who will protect them. And there'll be a kind of bargain between the sovereign and the rulers, between the rulers and the ruled. If the sovereign doesn't protect them, this is how he differs from medieval theorists, then all the obligations that the ruled, the subjects, have to the sovereign are void. He says that there's no, in this sense, he's a liberal, you might say, because he doesn't think legitimacy or inherited authority or intelligence or philosophical insight or sanctity or virtue, none of these things qualify anyone to rule. The only thing that rulers do for us is keep us safe. If they stop keeping us safe, kill them. That's what he recommends. Get a new ruler instead. I think that's much too simple, of course, an account of political authority, because human beings also, I think, they see other things in those who rule them. They want to see a sort of an identity or a story that they can relate to. But it's certainly important. And one of the things I discuss in the book, one of the periods of 20th century history I discuss in the book, is the Russian Revolution and what came after it. And before I wrote the book, I knew that there was a terrible civil war in post-Tsarist Russia. I knew that, and I knew that about 10 million people died in that war, from the war itself, from starvation, and from disease, principally, and from great massacres. What I didn't know until I went into it, and what I think wasn't fully known until recently, is that there were at one point 30 or over 30 statelets or states in post-Tsarist Russia, 30. Some of them fully fledged states with armies and diplomats and embassies. Some of them more or less just bands of bandits, if you like, but over 30 states with names. Now, what's interesting is that the Bolsheviks, who were only one of those states, conquered the whole of Russia, despite being subject to a foreign intervention by other powers, including Britain, America. I don't know if you know, but China and Japan had troops in the Civil War. Italy, Romania, what's now the Czech Republic, they all had troops. They all went in there to try and crush the Bolsheviks. They failed. All the other states failed. So in the end, you only had the Bolsheviks. And I think that is, in a way, an illustration of one of Hobbes's insights, which is, if you read accounts of the time, what people wanted from the Bolsheviks primarily was, the peasants might have wanted land, but what they wanted was peace. The Bolsheviks were the only party that unequivocally offered an end to the war, to the First World War. That was one thing. But secondly, they wanted domestic peace. They wanted to be able to walk through the cities and not be murdered. They wanted to be able to have a horse and not find it stolen and eaten for food. They wanted to find, not to have their house. A lot of the houses were wooden and were used up for firewood because there was no fuel. They wanted some kind of rudimentary order, and the Bolsheviks knew how to do that. They were pretty good at doing that. They were pretty ruthless, but they could do it. And I think that was a key reason why they won. But of course, you then get an irony or a paradox, which Hobbes didn't grasp in the 17th century, which is that the regime the Bolsheviks established then began to kill large numbers of people, even after it had won or come close to winning the Civil War. And you had what I called in the book an artificial state of nature, which is that the power of the communist of Lenin and his Bolshevik party became so great, and the power of the secret police, which he founded, became so strong that everyone was afraid of everyone else. So in a sense, they'd gotten from one state of nature to another state of nature. And if you read some of the diaries which came out when the communist regime fell in 1989, 1991, you can find accounts of what people were thinking at that time. Some of them survived all those years, 70 years. And what they thought, thank God we've got a proper kind of sovereign now, proper ruler, not the Tsar, that's all gone. Good riddance to that, but Lenin and they'll keep the peace. And then they found that people were being arrested and disappearing for various reasons, including being what was called a former person. Interesting idea. You could be arrested for being a former person. A former person could be a priest, it could be a landowner, but it could also be a cobbler or a peasant who hired one other person to help them work. It could be anybody, actually, an intellectual. The majority, we know, because the Bolsheviks kept records, were actually illiterate. So that tells me something. It tells me that they were mostly peasants or workers. You could also be a poet or a writer or a musician. By the way, just because most people haven't heard of this, Lenin was in some ways, he certainly wasn't a liberal, but he decided, he was persuaded to offer these former persons, at least the more distinguished among them, a way out. And so he hired 2 steamboats called the Philosopher's Steamboats. Have any of you heard of this? It's a true story. And they were all approached, mostly in big cities, the theologians, musicians, linguists, ballet impresarios and others, and said, look, got these 2 boats. You can go on them. You can leave. We won't stop you. In fact, we encourage you to leave. You won't fit into the new society. If you don't leave, all bets are off. So a large number did leave, and they ended up on the boats, the philosopher's boats. There's a whole book being written about this. And they ended up in Paris or Berlin or Manchuria, or China. So they created a state of nature. And that's actually one of the themes of the book, is that right throughout the 20th century, and even now, I think, people turn to dictatorship of one kind or another from fear of anarchy. So the idea that anarchy is always the worst, the idea that dictatorship is always the worst thing is not corroborated by experience. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, I was an early, you can read about this in my book, Gray's Anatomy, one of the very early critics of the Iraq War, because even before it started, I said the danger of this war is it'll break up the state of Iraq, which was an artificial state cobbled up by the British, actually, by one woman, actually, mainly, and a woman civil servant. And when it breaks down, it won't break down forever. there'll be terrible bloodshed, but out of it will come some kind of new dictatorships or dictatorships. So you had ISIS and various things like that came out of it. And if you use a kind of Hobbesian analysis, you can almost predict that. It's never the case, almost never the case, that revolutions which produce anarchy then produce democracy or freedom. They nearly always produce some other dictatorship, which, since it has to crush rival revolutionary movements, is nearly always more repressive than the one that was toppled. Now, that's what happened in Russia. So I illustrate that central insight of Hobbes's to do that. Now, one of the things I do in the book, it's not an academic book. I left academia in 2007, is I'm very interested in looking at the actual lives of people who lived in and coped with and responded to extreme situations. Because I think if you take a Hobbesian view, a view of Hobbes, extreme situations are not as abnormal as we think they are. Extreme situations are the default condition of human life. If you're out of it, you're lucky for as long as it lasts. If you lived in Central Europe or Eastern Europe, which at one point in my life I knew quite well, if you were, let's say, in the year 2000 and were 80, a man or woman of the age of 80, you'd have lived through not one regime, but many. You'd have lived through maybe the last part of the Habsburg Empire. You'd have lived through fledgling democracies in the Czech Republic for a while. In Poland, you'd have lived through fascism and Nazism, if you survived. You would have then lived through post-communist democracy, where it occurred even in Russia for a while. Then after that, you would live through if you lived till now, till a bit later, you'd be very old by then, but some people have. You'd live through the various forms of nationalist or post-democratic regimes that have occurred. So in a century, or less than a century, you'd have lived through 5 or 6 regimes with different laws, different banking systems, different currencies, different, not just different governments, but different everything, different educational systems, the whole lot. And that's most of Europe, after all, or all of Europe, nearly all of Europe, if you count the period of Western Europe after the World War. So our feeling in this country and 1 or 2 other countries, Iceland, Switzerland, the United States until recently, our feeling that of continuity, that continuity is normal in history, is an illusion, if you take a Hobbesian view. The normal human, same in China, same in India. If you live a long time, you live through several regimes, and they generally perish and rise again through violence. That's, as it was, the normal human, the default human situation. So I'm interested in people who live through that and leave some trace. And the ones I'm most interested in, some people criticize me, why don't you write about people who are terribly well known? I say, well, what's the point if they're terribly well known? Not much point in writing about them. I write about people who are almost erased from the margins of history. That's to say, people who survive and leave traces only by luck. Let me mention one, a Russian called Daniil Kalms. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of him. They're still not very well known. He was a poet and a dramatist and an absurdist. He was like what we call a Dadaist. He used to wander around with carrying a butterfly net. He thought of his life as an absurdist play or drama, and that was fine in the early days of the Bolshevik regime in Russia. He was free, but then as the repression got tighter, he got into trouble. And he didn't restrain his free speech. He thought that the Soviet Union he seems to have thought they would lose the war with Nazi Germany, which fortunately it didn't. But he was constantly under threat of harassment and death, actually, because the penalty for spreading defeatist propaganda was death. So he formed the idea, the plan, that he would get himself committed to a mental institution where he thought he'd be safe. And this was a sort of piece of absurdity. Unfortunately, he wasn't, well, he was safe in a way, but he starved to death during the Leningrad siege, actually. His wife, by the way, who was loyal to him all throughout this, survived, and she escaped. She was more of a survivor. She escaped the city during the siege, was captured as a slave laborer, escaped as a slave laborer, went to Paris, got to Paris, where her mother lived. She hated her mother. She seduced her mother's husband, left for Argentina with the husband. When she got to Argentina, she left the husband for a taxi driver who'd been a Russian aristocrat. Last she was heard of was, I think she's a magnificent character. Almost nothing known about her, actually, apart from these facts I mentioned. Last she heard, she was in the United States, where she died in her late 80s. Incredible character. But he perished. And we only know as much as we do about him because a suitcase of his unpublished writings was left in an apartment where one of his friends, walking in freezing cold across Leningrad, almost didn't make it and so on, found the suitcase. So he was almost erased. They're the people I'm interested in. The people are almost erased, but he wasn't erased, and we still know about him. A happier story, let me tell you a happier story, and then I'll go on further. Any of you heard of Teffy? Teffy was a Russian writer, enormously famous towards the end of the Tsarist regime, so famous that there were things like Mars bars were called Teffy bars. She was a brilliant writer. Her best short stories are as good as Chekhov's, or not better in my view. She knew everyone. She knew Rasputin. She knew Lenin and worked for Lenin. The Tsar was a fan. She worked for Lenin for a while. She was left-wing by leaning, but though not a Bolshevik, but she worked for Lenin for a while. And then when the revolution came, she lost everything pretty well, and crossed Russia during this period of the Civil War. So if you actually want to, her books have been published in the West in English, easily obtainable. If you want to know what it's actually like to live in an anarchical society where at any moment you could be robbed or killed or whatever, read her. But she successfully crossed Russia, crossed Ukraine, ended up at Odessa, and sailed to Paris, and sailed to Paris, sailed to Europe. And when she left that, she had, her only clothing was a shawl and a pair of silver dancing shoes. So she spent the time cleaning it was under Bolshevik command, the ship. She had to clean, do her share of the cleaning of the ship, wearing her silver shoes. And it was said that she was constantly harassed for smiling too much. So anyway, she ended up in Paris, where she lived for a long time, continued in poverty, but lived and successfully published a lot in the diaspora. So there's someone who is well worth reading, because although terrible things happened to her, or she witnessed terrible things, she always writes with great clarity and almost cheerfulness, despite all this. Someone wrote of her, when you look at her prose, it's like looking into a pool with no bottom. It's just clear all the way down. There's nothing muddy in it. He's a writer I love. So where are we now then? Well, I'll move on to where I think Hobbes got things rather wrong. I think it's for power to be legitimate, for a form of rule, a government or a sovereign to be legitimate, they've got to offer, as I say, something more than mere protection. Many of them can't even offer that, but they've got to offer something more. They've got to offer what might be called a story or even a myth. Now, throughout most of human history, these have been religious myths. They've been myths about the supernatural, about life after death. If death is what you fear more than anything else, either for yourself or you fear the loss of loved ones, then the idea that there's something that goes on after death, that this is not the end, will give you great comfort. And one of the things, I guess, about liberalism, one of the things about the kind of society we've lived in, is that they've tried to base authority and purely on a secular myth, a myth, unfortunately, that no one any longer believes in, or hardly anybody. The myth has been that of perpetual expansion or perpetual growth, or the idea that your children or your grandchildren will be almost automatically better off than you are. If you can believe that, and many people did for a long time, then you can live in the society. The institutions of the society, its inequalities of power and privilege will seem to you to be acceptable or justified or at least tolerable, because future generations will be better off. Now, I think that started to crumble in the West. If you ask when it started to crumble, it's hard to say, but perhaps as early as 2000 with the start of the kind of first tremors of the great financial crash, when the wonderfully named long-term capital management, have you ever heard about that? Melted down suddenly. It had the greatest economists in the world, had worked out a way of making profits automatically, so to speak, from big bets on small movements in options and government bonds. By the way, the reason it collapsed is the data on which they made these profits only went back 20 or 30 years. So it didn't include a big state like Russia defaulting on its debt, which it then did do. That's, by the way, that's something, if they say, we've got data on this, how far back does it go? Always ask them that. If it goes back less than 300 years, I wouldn't bother with it. They went back about, and by the way, they lost, I might sound rather harsh, but they lost their fortunes, the Nobel Prize-winning economists who did this. They had to sell, I was told that they had to sell their wine cellar as well. Serves them right. They made an absolute fortune for a while, then lost a lot. I think that's when we began to feel, however dimly, that we're living on melting ice, that this prosperity that's been enjoyed is fragile. And then, of course, there was the great financial crisis of 2007, 2008, when the whole system almost went under. If you read some accounts in Britain, it was thought that one morning by the evening, the banking system would be gone. And it almost was. And then since then, I think we've all felt that this is a situation in which one cannot take for granted that the next generation will be better off than we are, or that their children or grandchildren will be. And one other reason for that, which Hobbes couldn't know about, of course, is climate change. That's to say, we're now living in a period where we understand a bit, at least. I think climate change is real. My great friend, James Lovelock, who died recently at the age of 103, he was a great influence on me. He said it's real, but he also thought the models of it weren't very good. He thought it might go quicker or slower than the models predict. He told me that he tried to raise some money to have merchant ships around the world have thermometers hanging on them, which would actually show how much the temperature was really moving, in fact. And he couldn't get the money. And I said, why not? He said, well, I only asked for 250,000. If I'd asked for 250 million, I would have gotten it immediately. So he thought the models were no good, but he thought climate change was certainly very real. And he thought that it went in jumps, not in 1%, 2%, 3%. And because the world includes things like suddenly melting ice flows or sudden emissions of methane gas, and they can accelerate climate change, or there can be a period when it seems to almost stop and then suddenly starts again a few years later. So that's another reason which is at the back of our minds, why we think that the future won't be as prosperous as we took it for granted. And what I wrote, I did write this down, some of this down a long time ago, in my first reference to Fukuyama. I suppose you all know who Fukuyama is, Francis Fukuyama, the American thinker, who I met many times in many parts of the world. He's a very nice man, completely wrong, but he gets wronger and wronger. I found when meeting him that history ends approximately every 18 months, that he always finds optimistic and hopeful signs that it has ended or will end. And he's not, by the way, being misinterpreted. He often says that he's misinterpreted. He said, well, I mean history, I didn't mean that everything would stop. So I asked him, well, what did you mean? And what he meant, he then says, is he meant that liberal democracy would be accepted all over the world. Well, it isn't and hasn't been, and quite the opposite is happening now. Many countries in the world do not take the West as a model, or if it's a model, they take it as one to be avoided in many respects. So most of the South, Venezuela, South Africa, India, most of the world's human population do not accept Western democracy as a model. But anyway, I wrote, he published an article in the summer of 1989 called The End of History with a question mark, which disappeared in subsequent publications because he thought it was happening. And I wrote this in October 1989. What we are witnessing, this is just as the Soviet Union was falling. I was in Poland at the time, actually. What we are witnessing in the Soviet Union is not the end of history, but instead its resumption, and on decidedly traditional lines. All the evidence is that we are moving back into an epoch that is classically historical and not forward into the empty, hallucinatory, post-historical era projected in Fukuyama. Ours is an era in which political ideology, liberal as much as Marxist, has a rapidly dwindling leverage on events, and more ancient, more primordial forces, nationalist, fundamentalist, are contesting with each other. In retrospect, it may well appear that it was the static, polarized period of ideology, the period between the end of the Second World War and the present, that was the aberration. Now, I grew up, as some of you, grew up in the Cold War, and it was taken as given that something like a binary division of the world, there were lots of non-aligned countries, but they weren't that active at that time, that a binary division of the world into the West and the rest would maintain, be preserved, and that if it broke down, the West would be the winner. That these institutions and values would spread throughout the world. They didn't in Russia to begin with. The West made some fundamental mistakes, but they probably wouldn't have done anyway because the circumstances of a country that had been ruled for 70 years and the way that the Soviet Union had been prevented it. And I guess what I argue in this book is that far from liberalism or liberal democracy or the kind of way of life that existed in the West spreading throughout the world, it was an historical accident. Or it was a coincidence of historical accidents. Western imperialism, Western power, certain type of Christianity, certain kind of Jewish and Greek and other influences came together for a particular period and created what we think of as liberal society. In England, maybe lasted from about the time of Hobbes up till maybe around now. But there's nothing eternal in it. And on the contrary, it is, I think, passing away. And along with Western predominance in the world. I mean, the great political experiment in the world now, it seems to me at least, is not liberalism. That's run its course. It's China. Now, you might not like what you've read about it, and certainly there are aspects of it that I don't at all like or admire, the way they've treated the Tibetans and the Uyghurs and others, and also internally the repression it entails. But it's a vast experiment. The biggest what we might see in our lifetime. Doesn't mean it necessarily will work. In long-term Chinese history, there have been periods of warring states when the state breaks up and breaks down, and it may not work. But the marks of mortality are not there in it, whereas I think they are in America, for example. This is not what I'm going to talk about tomorrow, but whoever wins the next election in America, in one sense, it's very important. If Trump wins and is installed, then we'll be in a different world the next day, a really different world. If Biden wins, though, and whoever wins, it won't be accepted by a quarter to a third of the population. So there'll be a crisis whatever happens. We've got to that point now. So there's no way. Now, if that's the case, then a preoccupied, introverted, crisis-ridden America can't perform the function it has done well or badly or whatever you think of the matter as being the kind of the world's superpower any longer. It'll turn within itself. So I don't believe that, I don't believe what many people say. If you talk to American defense experts, they say, well, we'll sort of cut back in Europe and focus on China. They will cut back in Europe, whoever wins, which is bad news for the Ukrainians. But I'm not at all convinced that they'll then mass their forces for a collision with China. I don't think they'll do that either, because actually, if you read what defense military experts, hardcore people are writing now, they haven't got the equipment. And they can't produce it because a lot of the factories have been outsourced to the rest of the world. China's producing hundreds of certain types of ships, thousands of certain types of weapons. America's producing dozens or none. They've run out of the capacity to do it, and you can't call it up in a few years or so. So I think that's all over, and that the big experiment is probably China. That's not to say there couldn't be war. I was reading just a few days ago that some are afraid that war might start in the Philippines. It usually doesn't start where you think it starts. It starts somewhere else because there's competition there with China objecting to American policies there. So I'll end. I did say, well, let me make one further comment. What's replaced religion now that economic growth has, the faith in economic growth, which was its successor faith, has gone? In one of the chapters in the book, I call the chapter Feudalism and Fentanyl. What's replacing religion is opium. It's not just but it's artificial opium. It's synthetic opium. It has great advantages, by the way. In a way, it's the most booming industry in the world. Great advantages, synthetic. You don't need crops, which can be bombed or killed. It's all synthetic. It's easily hidden, and it's spreading all over the world. And I think the danger, actually, one of the big dangers is that as parts of society are abandoned, left, as parts of the post-industrial wastelands have been left, and whole cities have been sort of hollowed out, is that people turn to not the opium of the people, but just to synthetic opioids, actually, to keep themselves going. But having said all that, I promised I'd say something cheerful. I'm still struggling, I have to tell you, but I think my general message is, well, let me put it in form of what someone asked me at a previous event I did on this book. They said, if you were advising a young person how to spend their lives, I said, I never do. But he said, but if you had to, what would you say? So I said, I'd probably say two things. One is, this is a very dangerous time you're living in, but dangerous times are not times to play safe. Dangerous times are ones where it's dangerous to have long-term plans. It's dangerous to have plans you get deeply attached to. You should be attached to people, human beings, or even other animals. You should have deep attachments to others. Don't get attached to your plans, because things will change very, very rapidly. I mean, something I haven't mentioned because I'm not an expert on it, but I know some people who are, is I think our whole world could change in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years because of AI, artificial intelligence. It's enormously quick. Whole professions were vanishing overnight. Screenwriters. You can buy a South Korean phone now, has Samsung phone that does auditory person-to-person transfer. Somebody speaks to you in a language, I think there are about 120 in the phone, and that becomes English if you're English. You speak back to them and that becomes their language, Tibetan or whatever it is. So that's a whole class of people who've gone. So that's my first answer. And my second answer is, don't try and go against your own nature. Hobbes did, in a way. He wanted to be very prudent. He wanted to be very cautious. He believed that fear ruled everything and ruled him. But in the end, actually, it wasn't fear that ruled him. It was pride. He wanted to assert his own mind. And he wrote this book, which is still very worth reading, I think, all those years later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, John, for quite an elucidation of the new Leviathans. And I'm sure we're going to hear more about thoughts after liberalism. And I'm sure there will be lots of questions in the room. And you heard it from John himself. May you live in interesting times. That Chinese curse is clearly with us. So who wants to go first? We'll start in the room with questions, and then we'll go online. Now, John has asked for 2 questions at any one time. So if we can just do 2 questions initially, and then he'll answer them both. Who wants to like to go first? Gentleman at the back. So it's going to take me a while to get there.
You all haven't fallen into an abyss of despair.
Yes, just bear with me. I'm nearly there.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Nat. Thank you for the talk. I haven't read the book, so I'm just going on what you said, but I wonder, talking about post-liberalism, and I wonder whether that word is doing too much here, and whether there's a conflation between economic and political liberalism, and whether a more optimistic, to say you're trying to give us something cheerful take, is that we've been living since the 70s or so with an economic philosophy that said you didn't really need to worry about security. Economics was pro-freedom, you know, Milton Friedman talking about, you know, capitalism is freedom. economics, the market and wealth was just because it's voluntary transactions. No one would go into it unless they were beneficial. And obviously economic freedom, obviously it produced wealth. So what you've got is this swamping of all of the values by one value. But actually, if you look into, you talked about that huge cast of history from the 1600s right up to now. There have been so many different waves back and forth of economic and political liberalism going back and forth. So I just wonder whether there's more hope in there that, say, you talked about Biden, he defeated Warren and Sanders, but what he did is took a lot of Warren and Sanders's advisors into his own team. He took some of the fiercest anti-monopoly people and he's put them at the top of those agencies. Is there not actually hope for a rebirth of a better sort of liberalism?
Well, I'm sympathetic with a part of that for sure, because the association of liberalism with a narrow form of economic or market libertarianism, it's not exactly recent. It existed in the 19th century as well, but it's certainly not universal right throughout history. There have been liberals. I mean, after all, Keynes was probably a liberal, though in a famous talk he gave, "Am I a liberal?" he refused to answer the question, but he was a liberal in most senses of the term, and he recognized that Maynard Keynes, and he favored, of course, economic intervention. So you're right that the big shift in the 70s was not, so to speak, an eternal feature of, sorry, I said I would take 22 actually, but let me answer. It's so interesting, I can't, such an interesting question, I'll try and answer it. But on the other hand, there's a real problem now that there wasn't previously for liberalism, which is that when you have when you have something like globalization, not necessarily in the market sense of everywhere being a global free market, because that never was and certainly isn't now, it's very difficult to find an agency, an historical agent, that can change things. And certainly I don't for a moment, I mean, this is where I might have a different reading of recent events than you do. Biden might have taken on some people on his team, but that certainly won't determine the outcome of the coming election. And it certainly doesn't make it more likely that he'll prevail, in my view. Because despite that, the record of libertarian or neoliberal economic policy in the United States has been 30 years of stagnant or declining incomes for most of the population. That's still the case. It's worse in some regions of America than others. And also quite large sections of the middle class are feeling and are very precarious. I think a half of the American population has something like up to a month or less in terms of savings to call on in emergency. If they lose their jobs, they lose their medical care. So that's after 30 years of Biden and Clinton and the other and Obama. So I'm not particular, but you are right. That association is just an historical accident as well, if you like, within the historical accident of liberalism. But the problem when China is a great power and doesn't accept any of the dogmas of market libertarianism, contempt for them. When you have other powers developing in different parts of the world, the kind of gangsterized capitalism of Putin, for example, there's no agent that can bring about a systemic change, and there's no country, maybe with the exception of America, big enough to do it by themselves. We can't, for example. I mean, I would favor in Britain, just to give you an example, I've written this many, I'd favor taking back water and a number of other privatized industries back into public ownership, because I think the ownership of water has been a complete disaster, actually, practically for everybody. Problem is, can you do that when you have a world dominated by mercurial quicksilver capital markets? If you try and do it, you might have something like what happened during the Truss experiment, a ridiculous experiment, but it showed how powerful the markets were. You can't do that, just can't do it. We can't actually probably do what I would very much like to do, which is bring back into public ownership. I remember the trains, by the way, before they were publicly owned. I wouldn't say it was utopian, but they weren't as catastrophically disordered and bad as they are now. The only certain improvement since trains were privatized is coffee. The coffee's better than it was. That's about it, in my opinion. They're more expensive, they're more unreliable, they're more everything, actually, disastrous. But can we do that in a circumstance when the present Labour Party thinks not? Reeves thinks not. Reeves thinks, unless you keep borrowing to a fixed minimum, unless you stick to that script, you're sunk. We'll have trust all over again. And although I'm a critic of Reeves, I would like to see a more adventurous economic policy. I don't expect one, because she's probably right about that. She's probably right that if you did say, well, let's try it on again, let's borrow some money and take back water and others, it'd probably be disaster.
Okay, any more questions in the room? And if we could keep them a bit shorter, and then we can get 2 questions in.
Yeah, sorry, I should have done that. But it's such an interesting question, I have to reply to it in full.
I had a question about disillusion, and so much of your work has been about kind of deconstructing the myths and getting back to the truth. And you mentioned the loss of the economic myth. And if you kind of look at some young people in China as this experiment is unfolding of kind of the lying down movement and kind of giving up and quiet quitting and kind of a loss of any kind of faith. And I wonder whether you think about that and what you make of that.
It's happening everywhere, not just in the West, actually. In China, I'm glad you mentioned that, because there are people who try to drop out. And China, although it is in many ways a dictatorship, is such a big place. And there are gaps in the security, and to some extent you can drop out. And some of them even escape the country. Some leave the country. Some have turned up in places like Thailand and Cambodia and Burma and so on. Many of them are not industrial workers. Actually, I've read and I've heard from people that some of the Chinese tech people have escaped, fled, and reappeared in other countries because it's just too suffocating for them now. But they're not exactly dropping out. They want to carry on with the work they were doing before and feel they can't do it. But it's it's not necessarily a bad thing. I've said that one shouldn't be, when I began, one shouldn't be too risk averse. It's bad to be risk averse when everything's risky. It's better to do something bold, and that might be for some people dropping out, but it is also risky. Because unless you have skills of some kind, or attach yourself to some group or community that can keep you going, in the times ahead when you might have a big stock market crash, another great financial crash. At the moment, we're having in Britain local councils, a lot of them are either going under or they can't declare bankruptcy, but they can, legally they're not allowed to declare bankruptcy, but they have to cut back all kinds of services to the bone. I think the next shoe to drop is probably universities, by the way. A lot of those are really not making ends meet. And a lot of their income comes from foreign students who may not keep coming. I mean, if, for example, there was a major standoff between the UK and China, it could be stopped tomorrow. Then what would happen in Cambridge? What would happen in Leicester? Even now, because of fewer students coming in from Nigeria, for example, there have been several really quite massive drops in income. So you've got to be careful, but still, if you're young, take a chance. A very wise old man said to me, and you've probably heard it before, you won't regret what you've done, you'll regret what you haven't done. And so it's better to take a chance and follow your heart. And that might mean leaving Britain for somewhere else. Cambodia, Sweden, Finland, Peru, who knows? Nowhere is safe, and so you shouldn't be looking for safety. You should be looking, I think, now for opportunity.
Okay. Next question in the room. Yeah.
At the end of Straw Dogs, your book, the last sentence is, what's the meaning of life? And to see, you say.
No, I say, is it to see?
Is it to see, you
Question,
say, yes.
Not an answer.
Is it to see? So I'm asking that. Yeah. What is the meaning of life? It's to see the life, to think.
I now think that's too narrow. I have a friend who has been through several wars, and he says the meaning of life for him is music. It's to hear, not to see. And one of the things I talk about in many of my writings, Schopenhauer, rather unpleasant man in many ways, by the way, but for him, the meaning of life was music. Music. Me, it's more to see than I love music. I play it all the time, but I guess to me, a vision of something beautiful. It can be a person, an animal, a place, or a landscape, and it can be completely fugitive, completely ephemeral. That's something that means a lot to me. When someone asked me many years ago, what's your religion? I said, Proust. The Madeleine, remember the Madeleine? And he tried to contrive or build up a set of memories or images that would return to him and which gave him a kind of momentary immortality. Let's put it like that. More recently, I've been sunk in Shakespeare, so who's both a more light-hearted than Proust. Most of Proust's, one difference, most of Proust's great novel occurs indoors. He's a writer of the indoors. He's a writer of the feelings that one has indoors. Some of Shakespeare's at least appear on blasted heaths and even battlegrounds and so on. And they're both more, his plays I think are more light-hearted, the comedies and so on, and also darker actually than Proust. And by the way, back to Keynes, I just mentioned, Keynes went to the Versailles Peace Conference as an official representative. And two things happened there. First is when he got there, he lost his faith in human reason and human goodness, because he said he expected to find at Versailles all these powers, victorious powers, being concerned about the famine that existed in parts of Europe at that time and sharing things out in a way that would prevent further war. He didn't find that. He found they were all grabbing each other and ridiculing each other and punishing the loser, which was Germany. So he had a kind of minor nervous breakdown and went to bed for a week. Then when he got up, he wandered down into the lobby of the hotel and he saw Marcel Proust going through a door and he said that cheered him up. So he was cheered up by what was someone who was even then recognized as a great writer. Final point on Proust. Many of you may not know, he was a person of significant private means, but he maintained most of his fortune when most of his friends were ruined. And he had good advice, but it looks mainly that he invested in a whole lot of really absolutely crazy things, some of which came off. He didn't follow any of the regular advice. The regular advice which is recorded in Remembrance of Things Past, that the smartest, the shrewdest, the most worldly, wise individual gave was put most of your money into imperial czarist bonds. This is about 1912. You couldn't get anything safer. You get a low, you only get about 4%, but still couldn't be safer. It's completely safe. Most of his friends did that, and they were all totally ruined. So that's another, I think, don't follow conventional advice as to what is safe and what is not. What is considered to be safe very rarely is over a significant period of time, because it's based on memories that don't go back very far. That's where books come in, because if you can read about Proust and Hobbes and Keynes and these other writers and their lives, you'll see that uncertainty and danger are a permanent reality. Last words of Keynes. He worked himself to death after the Second World War, building the new economic order in the world, which did last for 30 or 40 years, so it was a great achievement. And he was warned by his doctor that he would kill himself. He said, okay, I'll kill himself. I'll just drink more champagne. That, I think, is, to me, an admirable attitude.
So you heard it here. The meaning of life is to live it. So...
The aim of life, well, I was asked, is it to see? Yes, for some people. Is it to hear? It is for some people. Is it to love? It is for some people. Is it to know? I'm very doubtful about that. Although I try to present the unvarnished truth, I think Nietzsche was on the right side when he said that we need art, we need Proust, yeah. we need Shakespeare, we need great poets to enable us to endure the truth. And I think art is a better response than frenzy, because the frenzy of faith, whether it be secular faith like communism or religious faith like various types of fundamentalism, always involves violence to other people. The worst that can happen to you with poetry. What's the worst that can happen to you from reading too much poetry? Get short-sighted. What's the worst that can happen to you for listening to too much music? If you can afford it, why not? So now there are those who would say, well, that's giving up on collective struggle. It's giving up on politics, giving up on, and I think there are often circumstances when it is wise to give up. But on the other hand, there are circumstances where people have no alternative. There are circumstances when the only way you can defend yourself is collectively. You can't always run away. You may be stuck, in which case you have to find some people you trust and who have similar goals, similar values to you, and work with them. There's no one answer. So there's no one meaning of life. And I think one shouldn't be too anxious about finding one. If you just keep your eyes and ears open, it'll present itself. Thank you.
Good. Now we've got some questions online. So according to Hobbes, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Yes.
How wrong was he?
Not that wrong. I mean, we live a lot longer now than we used to do. I remember reading about Liverpool in the early 19th century. Liverpool was like Shanghai in the early 20th century, in the early 19th century. The average life expectancy, and of course, a lot of that was death in childhood, was early 20s. It was completely cosmopolitan Liverpool at that time. Open city, no borders, no border controls. People from all over the world. Herman Melville visited and wrote a novel about it, describing it. So we live a lot longer now. Life expectancy is falling in America. It fell a lot after the collapse of communism in Russia, so it's not fixed. Will it go on rising? Well, it will for some people, I think, because these new longevity techniques, if followed, can enable a longer life. Someone who interests me is Ray Kurzweil. Anybody know who he is? He's an American writer and thinker who's now head of, he's been director of engineering at Google, vast resources. And he says, I can't remember how many, dozens and dozens of pills every day to keep him alive till 2043, when there'll be what he calls the singularity, and he'll be able to become immortal by uploading his mind into cyberspace. Now, I have various objections to that. I don't want to be uploaded into cyberspace in the first place. I'm not interested in that life. But the other is that it won't really work because cyberspace is really a projection of the material world. Cyberspace is not something independent like Plato's eternal forms. It's got an infrastructure, material infrastructure, which actually uses a lot of energy. Many of the crypto factories, for example, in the world have been in China until recently. And it's not a Chinese plot, it's because actually they were fueled by coal, which was the cheapest fuel there. So lots and lots of energy. Artificial intelligence uses sites that have to be cooled, so they're often associated with water shortage around them. So you actually can't get out of the finite world, this kind of idea of, and nor can you really get out of a world of conflicts. I mean, there are some of these people who say, we'll buy a private island and there'll be no tax and nobody can get at us, and we billionaires will live there forever. Well, you won't, because you'll then become a pawn in the game of geopolitics. Someone will, if you've got anything valuable, someone will try and take it. If there are any natural resources, so you'll have to build armies, and then you'll have to have alliances, and then you're back in history. So it's like getting out of history. You can't get out of the world like that. And I think what's interested in me, and I've actually met some of these people back in the 80s even in California, is that the movement for technological immortality has been around for a long time, and it sort of goes back actually to the 19th century. But in more recent times, it's been associated with a variety of technologies that promise a way out of history, not just mortality. I asked a group I met in the mid-80s in California, I said, how long will it, they were more modest than now, I said, how long will it take before science develops to the point at which you're frozen cadavers? They were the freezing people. You've heard about the cryogenesis. The cryogenics, how long will it be before you can be reanimated? They were more modest. They said maybe 100 years. Now they say 2043, so it's all accelerated. I said, well, have you thought what happened in the last 100 years? 2 world wars, Wall Street stock market crash, bit longer than that, Civil War in America. Do you think these little companies in Nevada, in the desert somewhere, where you have your frozen cadaver, or if you can't afford that, just the brain, actually, you can have cheapo immortality. They'll attach the rest of the body later, someone else's body, perhaps. And they looked at me sort of aghast. And what I understood was they thought the institutions of their own society were already immortal. So they thought there was immortality around them. So if you'd said, well, there'll be a great financial crash, there was no talk at that time, at least I have to say I didn't appreciate it. I only started talking to James Lovelock in the 90s. There was no talk of global warming or anything of that kind. So they just thought if they could have themselves frozen for long enough, they could come back and defeat death. Well, they wouldn't defeat it completely, but they'd become amortal. That's to say they could go on for not a long, long time. I think all of these things are complete illusions because they all depend on the Hobbesian point. They all depend. If you can't actually travel about, if you can't walk about the streets, if you can't take planes because they blow up or their computers are hacked, if there's disorder in society in general, then technological immortality is impossible, except maybe for a very small number. You can get increases of that in London, for example. The longevity between different boroughs is now about, I think, 10 or 12 years. So it's obvious that there are some big differences like that, but no one's going to live till then.
Okay, thank you.
Whether that's good news or bad news, I leave to you to decide.
Well, you've definitely hit a pessimistic vein here online. We've got some more questions here. One is, will the concept of mutually assured destruction inhibit the actions of autocratic states? And if not, what will be the consequences on world order?
I think they have. I think mutually assured, it's not infallible. It may break down, but it has prevented, if you think, I mean, after all, there have been various public statements. You needn't be tremendously anti-Russian to say there's been various public statements by Putin and others. If you do X, Y, Z, beware, I'll use nuclear. Now, I've talked to experts on this, which I'm not one, and they don't rule it out, but they say there are certain obstacles. First of all, they have, if you're talking about battlefield nuclear in Ukraine or somewhere, they have to be moved. And as soon as they're moved, they can be seen. They can be tracked. So it would be known in that case. If they were strategic and he was threatening to take out, which he also has done, that would, of course, be suicide. One can't completely rule it out because one of the things where Hobbes was wrong about was that people will hang on to their bare life. People value bare life, bare living more than anything else. He did allow some here and there that this wasn't true, by the way. He says people sometimes give up their lives for trifles, he says, like honor. But most of the time they want bare life more than anything else. It's not really the case. For example, in Japan, there were the kamikaze, who, by the way, some of whom were Christians, Japanese Christians, and some of whom didn't have any religion. So the idea of giving your life up in a struggle. The ones who weren't Christians or weren't religious were giving it up forever, remember? There was nothing after it that they were going to be rewarded for. And that was also true of many of the communists in the 20th century who gave it up forever. I was going to talk about, but I left myself no time. A writer I have learned a lot from, Arthur Koestler. Is he a name to you? Many of you, Arthur Koestler. He had a very adventurous life. He was in the Foreign Legion. He worked as a spy for the Soviet Union for a long time. He was captured by the Spanish fascists and sentenced to death, and spent his last night having a mystical experience. And then 5 minutes before he was about to be executed, it was commuted because they'd swapped him for someone else. But Koestler was interesting to me because he risked his life many, many times, as I say, in Spain and elsewhere, even though he didn't believe in the afterlife then at all. For him, death was the end, but he went into circumstances where it was very likely that he would die. Traveled all over Nazi Europe and so on. Managed to live to a reasonably good age and ended his own life then. So I think Hobbes was just wrong about that. But if he was wrong about that, that means there still could be a nuclear exchange. That mad mutually assured destruction doesn't always work. And of course, it can break down for other reasons. The equipment can be false, can give a false reading. And that's happened, I believe, 2 or 3 times. But the human intervention has stopped the process taking place. The risk now is that it might all be done by AI. And AI is very fast, incredibly fast. So actually in a more dangerous situation now, I think, than we were before. So it could happen, but it's not something that keeps me awake at night, I must admit. I think a risk of a major upset in the world is more likely to come from AI itself. AI itself, because one of the things AI does is it takes literally what it's programmed to do. You've probably come across it. If it produces as many paper clips as you can, it might gobble the entire resources from the world as far as it could, producing paper clips, so there's nothing left. It's not nuanced. It doesn't have a depth of experience, just does what it's told, and has no direct access to human experience. There's no evidence that it has experiences of its own. It simply responds to what it's been told to do. So my answer is relatively optimistic on that one, I think. But what would further proliferation increases the risks. The more players you've got, the more risk there is. And the worst risk is perhaps when a state that has nuclear weapons becomes a failed state. Because then who controls it? And that almost happened in Russia in 1990, but didn't, because the West collaborated with the then Yeltsin government, which prevented it actually from happening. It's one of the reasons why, although I think that what's happened in Ukraine is utterly horrific, I'm not one of those who say that the way out is to hope for the Russian state to collapse, because I then say, well, what if it collapses, but as in the 1920s, early 20s, there are 30 statelets. Which of them has nuclear weapons? Remember, some of them were just bandits. Would they hesitate to use them? Well, they might not know how to use them, to be fair, but some would. So I think the worst risks are in potentially failed states.
Okay, another question online relates to AI. And the question is, will AI increase the likelihood of creating more dictatorships and reduce anarchy?
It might. I mean, it'll reduce anarchy and reduce freedom at the same time, of course. You can now go into liquor stores in parts of the world, including China, and when you order, whatever you order is recognized. You're recognized by the camera in the room, and AI is able to actually increase or diminish your social credit by what you buy. So if you buy strong Polish vodka, you might lose 2 or 3 points. If you buy some delicious organic fruit drink, you might gain a couple. That's not entirely frivolous examples. It can be the basis of another society. So the more AI can do, the more can do that. I guess what people now think about AI or fear it, and many people involved in AI do fear this, is that it will acquire a kind of general intelligence of its own and therefore goals of its own, aims of its own, not be controllable by human beings. I'm less bothered about that because there isn't actually a universal AI system. What there are in the world are several corporate and different countries have got different AIs, and they're all competing in different ways, and they all have to some extent different goals and aims. So I think people say, couldn't there be a kind of AI like God? Couldn't there be? No, I think if the world goes that way, it'll be more like Homer's universe of warring gods. It'll be more like a pluralistic or polytheistic world. But of course, in that too, humans wouldn't be able to control very much. I mean, in Homer's world, or in Greek tragedy, the tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles and so on, humans can respond in different ways to what the fates give them. But they don't have a choice of their fates. And that's a very idea really kind of rather alien to liberalism and also to Western forms of theism, because they all work with basically an idea of free will. In the ancient world, there was some sort of margin maybe, but not much. Your fate, it comes with a portion. You were given a portion, whether by one god or by many gods, usually by many gods. And so I think that's maybe how AI will actually work in practice. But I think it is unstoppable. And for those of you here, maybe for all of us here, even people my age, it will change your life more and more quickly, probably, than climate change will, because it's a much more rapid process. By the way, finish on an optimistic note from James Lovelock, my friend. It's in his book on hyperintelligence, which is about AI. He said, people think that if AI really becomes as powerful as it is going to do, it'll be the end of humankind. But well, why should that be? He said, look, might they not want to preserve us? We'll be very slow moving. We won't be that interesting, but we might be aesthetically worth having around. Couldn't AI treat us the way we treat flowers at Kew Gardens? That was his optimistic scenario. And he said, couldn't they sort of keep us around? You know, they look at us, and I said, they're very slow, these little things kind of moving around. We move a million times quicker. But still, they're quite pretty, some of them, and let's keep them going. So here we are. We have the final non-tragic future. We can become like flowers in Kew Gardens. Thank you.
Okay, any more questions in the room?
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you for putting up with this, this series of